Jean-Auguste-Dominique Ingres was a French neoclassical painter. Although he considered himself to be a painter of history in the tradition of Nicolas Poussin and Jacques-Louis David, by the end of his life it was Ingres' portraits, both painted and drawn, that were recognized as his greatest legacy. A man profoundly respectful of the past, he assumed the role of a guardian of academic orthodoxy against the ascendant Romantic style represented by his nemesis, Eugene Delacroix. His exemplars, he once explained, were the great masters which flourished in that century of glorious memory when Raphael set the eternal and incontestable bounds of the sublime in art. I am thus a conservator of good doctrine, and not an innovator. Nevertheless, modern opinion has tended to regard Ingres and the other neoclassicists of his era as embodying the romantic spirit of his time, while his expressive distortions of form and space make him an important precursor of modern art. Early years. Ingres was born in Montauban, Tarn-et-Garonne, France, the first of 7 children of Jean-Marie Joseph Ingres and his wife Anne Molette. His father was a successful jack-of-all-trades in the arts, a painter of miniatures, sculptor, decorative stonemason, and amateur musician. His mother was the nearly illiterate daughter of a master wigmaker. From his father the young Ingres received early encouragement and instruction in drawing and music, and his first known drawing, a study after an antique cast, was made in 1789. Starting in 1786 he attended the local school École des Frères l'Éducation chrétienne, but his education was disrupted by the turmoil of the French Revolution, and the closing of the school in 1791 marked the end of his conventional education. The deficiency in his schooling would always remain for him a source of insecurity. In 1791, Joseph Ingres took his son to Toulouse, where the young Jean-Auguste-Dominique was enrolled in the Académie Royale de Peinture, Sculpture et Architecture. There he studied under the sculptor Jean-Pierre Vigan, the landscape painter John Bryant, and the neoclassical painter Guillaume Joseph Roques. Roque's veneration of Raphael was a decisive influence on the young artist. Ingres won prizes in several disciplines, such as composition, figure and antique, and life studies. His musical talent was developed under the tutelage of the violinist Lejeune, and from the ages of 13 to 16 he played second violin in the Orchestre du Capitole de Toulouse. In Paris, in March 1797, the Academy awarded Ingres first prize in drawing, and in August he traveled to Paris to study with Jacques-Louis David, France's, and Europe's, leading painter during the revolutionary period, in whose studio he remained for 4 years. Ingres followed his master's neoclassical example but revealed, according to David, a tendency toward exaggeration in his studies. He was admitted to the painting department of the École des Beaux-Arts in October 1799, and won, after tying for second place in 1800, the Grand Prix de Rome in 1801 for his The Ambassadors of Agamemnon in the Tent of Achilles. His trip to Rome, however, was postponed until 1806, when the financially strained government finally appropriated the travel funds. Working in Paris alongside several other students of David in a studio provided by the state, he further developed a style that emphasized purity of contour. He found inspiration in the works of Raphael, in Etruscan vase paintings, and in the outline engravings of the English artist John Flaxman. In 1802 he made his debut at the Salon with Portrait of a Woman. The following year brought a prestigious commission, when Ingres was one of 5 artists selected to paint full-length portraits of Napoleon Bonaparte as first consul. These were to be distributed to the prefectural towns of Liege, Antwerp, Dunkirk, Brussels, and Ghent, all of which were newly ceded to France in the 1801 Treaty of Lunéville. Napoleon is not known to have granted the artists a sitting, and Ingres' meticulously painted portrait of Bonaparte, first consul, appears to be modelled on an image of Napoleon painted by Antoine Jean Gros in 1802. In the summer of 1806 Ingres became engaged to Marie-Anne Julie Forstier, a painter and musician, before leaving for Rome in September. Although he had hoped to stay in Paris long enough to witness the opening of that year's Salon, in which he was to display several works, he reluctantly left for Italy just days before the opening. At the Salon, his paintings, self-portrait, portraits of the Riviere family, and Napoleon I on his imperial throne, produced a disturbing impression on the public, due to not only Ingres' stylistic idiosyncrasies but also his adoption of Carolingian imagery in representing Napoleon. David delivered a severe judgment, and the critics were uniformly hostile, finding fault with the strange discordances of color, the want of sculptural relief, the chilly precision of contour, and the self-consciously archaic quality. Chaussard condemned Ingres' style as Gothic and asked, how, with so much talent, a line so flawless, and attention to detail so thorough, has Ingres succeeded in painting a bad picture? The answer is that he wanted to do something singular, something extraordinary. Ingres' intention is nothing less than to make art regress by 4 centuries, to carry us back to its infancy, to revive the manner of Jean de Bruges. Ingres' stylistic eclecticism represented a new tendency in art. The Louvre, newly filled with booty seized by Napoleon in his campaigns in Italy and the Low Countries, provided French artists of the early 19th century with an unprecedented opportunity to study, compare, and copy masterworks from antiquity and from the entire history of European painting. As art historian Marjorie Cohn has written, at the time, art history as a scholarly inquiry was brand new. Artists and critics outdid each other in their attempts to identify, interpret, and exploit what they were just beginning to perceive as historical stylistic developments. From the beginning of his career, Ingres freely borrowed from earlier art, adopting the historical style appropriate to his subject, leading critics to charge him with plundering the past. Newly arrived in Rome, Ingres read with mounting indignation the relentlessly negative press clippings sent to him from Paris by his friends. In letters to his prospective father-in-law, he expressed his outrage at the critics. "So the Salon is the scene of my disgrace. The scoundrels, they waited until I was away to assassinate my reputation. I have never been so unhappy." He vowed never again to exhibit at the Salon, and his refusal to return to Paris led to the breaking up of his engagement. Julie Forstier, when asked years later why she had never married, responded, "When one has had the honor of being engaged to Ingres, one does not marry." In Rome, installed in a studio on the grounds of the Villa Medici, Ingres continued his studies as required of every winner of the Prix. He sent works at regular intervals to Paris so his progress could be judged. As his envoy of 1808, Ingres sent Oedipus and the Sphinx and the Valpenconbather, hoping by these 2 paintings to demonstrate his mastery of the male and female nude. The verdict of the academicians was that the figures were not sufficiently idealized. In later years Ingres painted variants of both compositions. Another nude begun in 1807, the Venus Anadyomene, remained in an unfinished state for decades, to be completed 40 years later and finally exhibited in 1855. He produced numerous portraits during this period. Madame Duvalquet, François Marius Granet, Edme François Joseph Bochet, Madame Pancoca, and that of Madame la Comtesse de Tournon, mother of the prefect of the department of the Tiber. In 1810 Ingres' pension at the Villa Medici ended, but he decided to stay in Rome and seek patronage from the French occupation government. In 1811 Ingres finished his final student exercise, the immense Jupiter and Thetis, which was once again harshly judged in Paris. Ingres was stung, the public was indifferent, and the strict classicists among his fellow artists looked upon him as a renegade. Only Eugene Delacroix and other pupils of Pierre Narcisse Guérin, the leaders of that romantic movement for which Ingres throughout his long life always expressed the deepest abhorrence, seem to have recognized his merits. Although facing uncertain prospects, in 1813 Ingres married a young woman, Madeleine Chapelle, who had been recommended to him by her friends in Rome. After a courtship carried out through correspondence, he proposed to her without having met her, and she accepted. Their marriage was a happy one, and Madame Ingres acquired a faith in her husband which enabled her to combat with courage and patience the difficulties of their common existence. He continued to suffer the indignity of disparaging reviews, as Don Pedro of Toledo kissing Henry IV's sword, Raphael in the Faun Arena. Several portraits, and the interior of the Sistine Chapel met a generally hostile critical response at the Paris Salon of 1814. A few important commissions came to him. Notably, the French governor of Rome asked him to paint Virgil reading the Aeneid for his residence, and to paint two colossal works, Romulus's victory over Acron and the Dream of Ossian, for Montecavallo, a former papal residence undergoing renovation to become Napoleon's Roman palace. These paintings epitomized, both in subject and scale, the type of painting with which Ingres was determined to make his reputation, but, as Philip Conisby has written, for all the high ideals that had been drummed into Ingres at the academies in Toulouse, Paris, and Rome, such commissions were exceptions to the rule, for in reality there was little demand for history paintings in the grand manner. Even in the city of Raphael and Michelangelo, art collectors preferred light-hearted mythologies, recognizable scenes of everyday life, landscapes, still lifes, or likenesses of men and women of their own class. This preference persisted throughout the 19th century, as academically oriented artists waited and hoped for the patronage of state or church to satisfy their more elevated ambitions. Ingres traveled to Naples in the spring of 1814 to paint Queen Caroline Murat, and the Murat family ordered additional portraits as well as 3 modestly scaled works: The Betrothal of Raphael, La Grande Odalisque, and Paolo and Francesca. Apart from the betrothal, however, he never received payment for these paintings, due to the collapse of the Murat regime in 1815. With the fall of Napoleon's dynasty, he found himself essentially stranded in Rome without patronage. During this low point of his career, Ingres made his living by drawing pencil portraits of the many tourists, in particular the English, passing through post-war Rome. For an artist who aspired to a reputation as a history painter, this seemed menial work, and to the visitors who knocked on his door asking, "Is this where the man who draws the little portraits lives?" he would answer with irritation, "No. The man who lives here is a painter." Nevertheless, the portrait drawings he produced in such profusion during this period are of outstanding quality, and rank today among his most admired works. Mining the vein of the small-scale historical genre piece, in 1815 he painted Aretino and Charles V's ambassador as well as Aretino and Tintoretto, an anecdotal painting whose subject, a painter brandishing a pistol at his critic, may have been especially satisfying to the embattled Ingres. Among his other paintings in the same troubadour style were Henry IV playing with his children and the death of Leonardo. In 1817 the Count of Blacas, who was ambassador of France to the Holy See, provided Ingres with his first official commission since 1814, for a painting of Christ giving the keys to Peter, completed in 1820. This imposing work was well received in Rome, but to the artist's chagrin the ecclesiastical authorities there would not permit it to be sent to Paris for exhibition. A commission came in 1816 or 1817 from the family of the celebrated Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, Duke of Alva, for a painting of the Duke receiving papal honors for his repression of the Protestant Reformation. Ingres loathed the subject. He regarded the Duke as one of history's brutes, and struggled to satisfy both the commission and his conscience. After revisions which eventually reduced the Duke to a tiny figure in the background, Ingres left the work unfinished. He entered in his diary, "Jurates force par la nécessité de peindre un pareil tableau, Dieu a voulu qu'il reste en aborture." During this period, Ingres formed friendships with musicians including Paganini, and regularly played the violin with others who shared his enthusiasm for Mozart, Haydn, Gluck, and Beethoven. The works he sent to the 1819 Salon were La Grande Odalisque, Philip V and the Marshal of Berwick, and Roger Freeing Angelica, which were once again condemned as Gothic by critics. In Florence, Ingres and his wife moved to Florence in 1820 at the urging of the Florentine sculptor Lorenzo Bartolini, an old friend from his years in Paris. His friendship with Bartolini, whose worldly success in the intervening years stood in sharp contrast to Ingres' poverty, quickly became strained, and Ingres found new quarters. In 1821 he finished a painting commissioned by a childhood friend, Monsieur de Pastoret. The entry of Charles V into Paris, de Pastoret also ordered a portrait of himself in a religious work. The major undertaking of this period, however, was a commission obtained in August 1820 with the help of de Pastoret, to paint the Vow of Louis XIII for the Cathedral of Montauban. Recognizing this as an opportunity to establish himself as a painter of history, he spent 4 years bringing the large canvas to completion, and he traveled to Paris with it in October 1824. Triumphal return to Paris and angry retreat to Rome. The Vow of Louis XIII, exhibited at the Salon of 1824, finally brought Ingres critical success. Conceived in a Raphaelesque style relatively free of the archaisms for which he had been reproached in the past, it was admired even by strict Davidians. Ingres found himself celebrated throughout France. In January 1825 he was awarded the Cross of the Legion d'Honneur by Charles X, and in June 1825 he was elected to the Institute. His fame was extended further in 1826 by the publication of Sudre's lithograph of La Grande Odalisque, which, having been scorned by artists and critics alike in 1819, now became widely popular. A commission from the government called forth the monumental apotheosis of Homer, which Ingres eagerly finished in a year's time. From 1826 to 1834 the studio of Ingres was thronged, and he was a recognized chef d'école who taught with authority and wisdom while working steadily. The critics came to regard Ingres as the standard-bearer of classicism against the Romantic school, a role he relished. The paintings, primarily portraits, that he sent to the Salon in 1827 were well received. Despite the considerable patronage he enjoyed under the Bourbon government, Ingres regarded the July Revolution of 1830 with enthusiasm. That the outcome of the revolution was not a republic but a constitutional monarchy was satisfactory to the essentially conservative and pacifistic artist, who in a letter to a friend in August 1830 criticized agitators who still want to soil and disturb the order and happiness of a freedom so gloriously, so divinely won. Ingres' career was little affected, and he continued to receive official commissions and honors under the July monarchy. Ingres exhibited in the Salon of 1833, where his portrait of Louis-François Bettine was a particular success. The public found its realism spellbinding, although some of the critics declared its naturalism vulgar and its coloring drab. The thin-skinned artist was outraged, however, by the criticism of his ambitious canvas of the martyrdom of Saint Symphorien, shown in the Salon of 1834. Resentful and disgusted, Ingres resolved never again to work for the public, and gladly availed himself of the opportunity to return to Rome, as director of the École de France, in the room of Horace Vernet. There, although the time he spent in administrative duties slowed the flow of paintings from his brush, he executed Antiochus and Stratonice, portrait of Luigi Cherubini, and the Odalisque with Slave, among other works. In 1839, Franz Liszt visited the Villa Medici, and Ingres formed a friendship with him.